The first notice was an insult, tucked into the mailbox flag like a forgotten grocery circular. Mark almost threw it away with the pizza coupons and the flyer for a lawn aeration service he didn't need. His grandfather had cultivated this land for 60 years. The soil breathed just fine. But the paper was a heavy, creamy cardstock, incongruously elegant for its mundane purpose. Unfolding it, he read the laser-printed words. The font a severe, no nonsense Times New Roman. Courtesy notice, Sunset Valley Homeowners Association. Dear resident, this notice is a friendly reminder regarding the foliage on your property located at 1200 Old Creek Road, as per the Sunset Valley CC&Rs. Farger 8.4.2, Preservation of View Corridors. All residents are required to maintain their landscaping so as not to obstruct designated community view corridors. We have observed that a stand of oak trees on the western edge of your lot is currently impeding the view of Sunset Lake from the community park's main overlook. Please take action to address this unapproved foliage within 14 days. Thank you for your cooperation in keeping Sunset Valley beautiful. Sincerely, the Architectural Control Committee. Mark read it twice, a small, humorless laugh escaping his lips. He crumpled the notice into a tight ball, the thick paper resisting, a metaphor he was too tired to appreciate. He tossed it into the recycling bin. Resident. He wasn't a resident of Sunset Valley. He wasn't a member of their association. His 25-acre ranch, a sprawling island of old Florida history, predated their manicured cul-de-sacs by a quarter century. The property line was a clear, sharp demarcation between his world of rustling longleaf pines and ancient, gnarled oaks, and their world of identical beige houses with pristine, chemically green lawns. His grandfather, a man whose hands were mapped with the lines of hard work and integrity, had been offered a fortune in the 80s by the developers who built Sunset Valley. They'd wanted to level his oaks, drain his creek, and stamp out another 100 homes. He'd refused, calmly and irrevocably, and they'd been forced to build their little kingdom around him. Mark had inherited the ranch, the land, the house, the legacy of quiet defiance 2 months ago, fleeing a tech career in Atlanta that had burned him down to a wick. He came here seeking peace, a place where the loudest sound was the evening call of whip poor wills, not the incessant ping of a project management app. He thought nothing more of the notice. It was a bureaucratic error, an overzealous committee member with a new clipboard and a poor understanding of county plat maps. A single, anonymous piece of paper was a nuisance, not a threat. He underestimated the quiet, grinding power of a homeowners association. He underestimated the menace that could be conveyed through polite, unsigned correspondence. Later that afternoon, he was on his porch, watching the sun filter through the very trees the notice had condemned, when his neighbor, Arthur Vance, ambled over. Arthur was 81, with a slow, deliberate gait and eyes that had seen the valley transform from citrus groves to subdivisions. He'd been a friend of Mark's grandfather for 50 years. "Saw the management company car cruise by earlier," Arthur said, leaning against the porch rail. He held a glass of iced tea, the condensation tracing lines down the side. Figured they were lost. "Apparently not," Mark said, gesturing toward the recycling bin. "Got a friendly reminder from the HOA about my trees blocking their view." Arthur's face, normally a pleasant landscape of wrinkles, hardened almost imperceptibly. "Ah, Section 8.4.2, I'd wager." Mark blinked. "You know their bylaws." "Had to. Back in the 90s, Arthur said, taking a slow sip of his tea. "They tried a similar thing with your granddad. Claimed a stand of his pines on the South Ridge was a community nuisance. Your grandpa. He didn't yell. He didn't get angry. He just pulled out the original county surveys and the HOA's own governing documents and quietly, politely, showed them exactly where their authority ended. Took him weeks, but he won. He always said, "The truth is in the paperwork. Son, you just have to have the patience to dig for it." The story was comforting. A small piece of his grandfather's wisdom passed down through a friend. It reinforced his decision to ignore the notice. This was a battle his family had already fought and won. "They'll probably send another one," Arthur added, his gaze fixed on the oaks. "The new board president is zealous. Carol Stone. Moved in a few years back. Seems to think the CC&Rs are holy scripture, and she's the sole interpreter." Mark nodded, but the warning didn't fully register. He was still wrapped in the blanket of his grandfather's legacy, confident in the simple, irrefutable truth of his property line. He had the deed. He had the survey. What he didn't have was an understanding of the kind of war he was about to enter. A war fought not with shouting and anger, but with certified mail, procedural deadlines, and the slow, suffocating pressure of a bureaucracy weaponized by a single, determined individual. The crumpled notice in his recycling bin wasn't the end of a mistake. It was the opening salvo. The certified letter arrived a week later. The mail carrier, a cheerful woman named Brenda, who always had a biscuit for Mark's dog, handed him the small green and white postcard to sign with an apologetic shrug. "Official business," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. A cold knot formed in his stomach. The certified mail sticker was unmistakable. This was no friendly reminder. This was an escalation. He signed the return receipt, the pen scratching against the card, an act that felt binding and ominous. Inside his grandfather's quiet house, surrounded by the scent of old books and lemon oil, he slit the envelope open with a trembling finger. The paper inside was the same heavy, creamy cardstock, but the tone had shifted from polite to procedural. Formal notice of violation. Sunset Valley Homeowners Association. Via certified mail. Return receipt requested USPS. Tracking your 9407 1234 5678 9012 3456 78. Dear Mr. Mark Thorne, this letter serves as a formal notice of a continuing violation of the Sunset Valley covenants, conditions, and restrictions CC&Rs on your property located at 1200 Old Creek Road. Violation: unapproved foliage, obstructing designated view corridor, governing document reference CC&Rs. Paragraph 8.4.2, preservation of view corridors. As outlined in our courtesy notice dated October 5, 2023, the stand of oak trees on the western portion of your lot is in violation of the community's governing documents by impeding the view of Sunset Lake from a designated common area. A fine of $100 has been assessed to your account. This fine will continue to be assessed on a weekly basis until the violation is cured. You have the right to contest this violation and fine by requesting a hearing before the Board of Directors. Your request for a hearing must be submitted in writing to the management company within 14 days of the date of this notice. Failure to request a hearing will be considered an admission of the violation, and the fine will stand. Please govern yourself accordingly. Sincerely, the Board of Directors, Sunset Valley, HOA CEO Prestige Community Management. The cold knot in his stomach tightened into a block of ice. Assessed to your account. What account? He wasn't a member. $100 a week. The absurdity of it was overshadowed by the sheer arrogance. The language was sterile, impersonal, and utterly confident in its authority. The clock was now ticking. 14 days. This wasn't a mistake anymore. It was an attack. His first instinct was to call a lawyer. But that seemed like a disproportionate response. This had to be a misunderstanding. Something a simple phone call could clear up. He found the number for Prestige Community Management on the letterhead and dialed, the phone feeling slick in his palm. The woman who answered had a voice that was aggressively cheerful. Prestige Community Management. This is Tiffany. How can I make your day more prestigious? Mark took a deep breath. Hello. My name is Mark Thorne. I received a violation notice regarding my property, but my property is not part of the Sunset Valley HOA. I believe there's been an error. There was a pause, followed by the clacking of a keyboard. Thorne. 1200 Old Creek Road. Yes. I have your file right here. Violation for unapproved foliage. Paragraph 8.4.2. Right. But that's the mistake, Mark said, trying to keep the frustration out of his voice. My property predates the HOA. It was never annexed. It's not subject to your CC&Rs. Sir. Tiffany's voice lost its cheerfulness, replaced by a practiced, monotone drone. According to our records, your property is adjacent to a designated common area, and the view corridor rule applies to all adjacent properties to protect community assets. The violation is valid. That's not legally possible, Mark insisted. You can't enforce your private rules on my private land. Who can I speak to about this? Someone on the board. All communications with the board must go through the management company, she recited, as if reading from a script. If you wish to dispute the violation, you must request a hearing in writing, as stated in the notice. It was a bureaucratic brick wall. She wasn't there to solve problems. She was there to enforce procedures. Arguing with her was like arguing with a vending machine. He was getting nowhere. Can I at least speak to the board president, he asked. A last-ditch effort. Carol Stone. There was another pause. One moment. He was placed on hold, subjected to a tinny, instrumental version of a forgotten 80s pop song. He paced his grandfather's study, his eyes falling on a framed photo on the desk. His grandfather, younger, standing proudly in front of one of the now condemned oaks. The legacy felt less like a comfort now, and more like a burden he was failing to protect. After 5 minutes, a new voice came on the line. It was smooth, calm, and impeccably polite. This is Carol Stone. How can I help you? Mr. Thorne. Mrs. Stone. Thank you for taking my call, Mark began, forcing himself to match her calm tone. I'm calling about a violation notice I received. My property isn't in your HOA, so I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding. Ah, yes. The Oaks, she said. A hint of something that might have been sympathy in her voice, but felt more like condescension. A beautiful, historic property. My heart aches at the thought of losing even a single one of those magnificent trees. The feigned empathy set his teeth on edge. Then you'll agree that the violation notice is an error, and you can have it rescinded. I'm afraid it's not that simple. Mark, may I call you Mark? She continued, not waiting for an answer. The covenants are quite clear. We have a duty to all residents to protect community assets, and that includes the view from the park. The board has reviewed the matter, and our decision is firm. The violation stands. My property isn't a community asset, Mark said, his voice hardening, and my grandfather's trees are not your concern. You have no legal jurisdiction here. That is your interpretation. Of course, Carol said, her voice still maddeningly placid. You are more than welcome to present your case at a hearing. That is the proper procedure. We are simply following the rules as they are written. I do hope you'll reconsider complying. It would be a shame for this to escalate with further fines. The line between polite and menacing had been expertly blurred. It was a veiled threat. delivered with the pleasantness of a neighbor discussing the weather. She wasn't an unhinged woman screaming about property lines. She was far more dangerous. She was a bureaucrat who had found a weapon in the fine print and was prepared to use it, patiently and procedurally, until she got what she wanted. He hung up the phone, the silence of the house pressing in on him. The fight his grandfather had won 30 years ago was back. But this time, the opponent wasn't just overzealous. She was methodical, implacable, and hiding behind a wall of rules and procedures. Arthur was right. The truth was in the paperwork. And Mark realized, with a sinking feeling, that he was going to have to start digging. The war of attrition began. Mark's first step was to arm himself. Following the cold, formal instructions on the violation notice, he drafted a letter to Prestige Community Management. He kept it short, professional, and devoid of emotion. It was a formal request for a complete and current copy of the Sunset Valley HOA's governing documents, the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC&Rs, the bylaws, the rules and regulations, and the minutes from all Board of Directors meetings for the past 6 months. He sent it via certified mail, just as they had done to him, creating his own paper trail. While he waited, he sought out Arthur, finding him in his garage, meticulously cleaning a set of old woodworking tools. The smell of sawdust and oil was a comforting anchor in a world that had suddenly become abstract and hostile. "She's not backing down," Mark said, explaining the phone call with Carol. Arthur paused his work, wiping his hands on a soft cloth. "Didn't figure she would. Carol's the type who mistakes stubbornness for strength. Your granddad kept a file on everything: deeds, surveys, correspondence. Even had a copy of the original development plans for this whole place. Might be in his study, in that old metal filing cabinet." The filing cabinet was a relic, olive green and covered in a fine layer of dust. Inside, organized with his grandfather's characteristic precision, was a folder labeled HOA 1993 Dispute. It contained copies of letters, his grandfather's handwritten notes, and a dusty, rolled-up survey map. Mark carefully unrolled it on the dining room table. It was an old blueprint, covered in technical jargon and faded lines he couldn't fully decipher. But one thing was clear: a thick, definitive line marking his property, with the words "Not a part of this plat" stamped in red ink within its borders. It felt like a message from the past, a tool left behind for a future battle. This, however, wasn't enough. The old map was a clue. But he needed the official, filed version from the county. He needed an expert. He remembered a name his grandfather had mentioned once with deep respect: Susan Gable. A woman who had retired after 40 years as a senior clerk at the county recorder's office. She was legendary for her encyclopedic knowledge of property records and her utter contempt for bureaucratic nonsense. He found her number in an old address book and called, half expecting her to have moved or passed on. A gruff, no-nonsense voice answered on the second ring: Susan Gable. Mark explained his situation, mentioning his grandfather, the HOA, and the mysterious Paragraph 8.4.2. There was a moment of silence on the line. Henry Thorne's grandson. "Hey, your granddad was a good man. Fought those developers tooth and nail. A view corridor easement on a property that predates the subdivision. That's rich." She chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Meet me at the county records office tomorrow, 9 a.m., sharp. Bring your grandfather's old map, and coffee, black." The next morning, Mark met Susan in the hushed, dusty archives of the county recorder's office. She was a small, bird-like woman with sharp eyes and an energy that belied her age. She moved through the labyrinth of shelves and microfiche readers with an authority that made the current county employees step aside. HOAs, she muttered, leading him to a large table. A bunch of petty tyrants running a miniature government with none of the oversight. Let's see what they think they have on you. She spread his grandfather's old map out, her finger tracing the faded lines with practiced ease. This is a good start. This is the developer's preliminary survey. Now, we find the official, filed plat map. For the next 2 hours, Susan was a master at work. She cross-referenced parcel numbers, pulled massive, cloth-bound record books from shelves, and scrolled through decades of digital files. She taught Mark how to read the legal descriptions, how to spot an easement, and how to understand the hierarchy of recorded documents. She was his investigator, his guide through a world of legal jargon designed to be impenetrable to the average person. Meanwhile, a thick envelope arrived from Prestige Management. It contained the CC&Rs and bylaws. But the meeting minutes were another story. The pages discussing a new development proposal adjacent to the HOA were heavily redacted. Thick black lines obscuring names, figures, and entire paragraphs. It was a blatant, arrogant act of concealment. What were they hiding? The redactions were a breadcrumb, a clear sign that the issue with his trees was a pretext for something else entirely. He scanned the documents, his eyes landing on the names of the board members: Carol Stone, president, and a junior member, Ben Carter. The name seemed vaguely familiar. Back at the recorder's office, Susan finally let out a triumphant, "Aha!" She had 2 documents laid out on the table. The first was the official, recorded plat map for the Sunset Valley subdivision. The second was the deed for the common area, the park from which the view was supposedly being obstructed. "Look here," Susan said, her finger jabbing at the plat map. "Here's your property. Here's the HOA common area. And right here, on their own official map, is the easement for the view corridor." The easement was a clearly defined trapezoid of space, an invisible legal boundary. "And as you can see," she said, her voice dripping with satisfaction, "it stops a full 50 feet from your property line. They have no right, no claim, no authority to dictate what you do with your trees. It's written in stone, right here, in the public record." It was the smoking gun. A wave of relief washed over Mark. The fight was over before it had truly begun. But Susan wasn't finished. "Now." "That answers the how," she said, her sharp eyes narrowing. "But it doesn't answer the why. Why is this stone woman so obsessed with trees that aren't even in her line of sight? Let's pull the records for the new development they're trying to hide in those minutes." Her fingers flew across the keyboard again, pulling up business filings and property records for a company called Apex Luxury Homes, the developer behind the proposed new subdivision that would border the HOA on the other side of Mark's ranch. She cross-referenced names, addresses, LLCs, and then she stopped. She turned the monitor toward Mark. "Well, I'll be..." On the screen was a corporate filing for a small consulting firm that Apex had hired for community outreach and zoning guidance. The principal of that firm was listed as Carol Stone. A separate document, a publicly filed statement of economic interest, showed that she stood to receive a substantial commission, a finder's fee, if Apex Luxury Homes successfully acquired the land and secured zoning approval for their new development. And the prime, most desirable lots in that new development. They would be the ones with a clear, unobstructed view of Sunset Lake, a view that was currently blocked by a stand of 60-year-old oak trees on Mark Thorne's private property. The twist landed like a punch to the gut. This was never about a bylaw. It wasn't about a view from a community park. It was about money. Greed. Carol Stone wasn't a misguided zealot. She was a corrupt official, using the power of the HOA as a cudgel to bully a landowner into clearing the way for her own personal payday. The polite voice on the phone. The pretense of community duty, it was all a calculated, cynical lie. And Mark was standing in her way. The discovery of Carol's financial motive changed the texture of the conflict. It was no longer a defensive battle for Mark's rights. It was now an offensive campaign against her corruption. Armed with his evidence, the official plat map, the easement deed, and the corporate filings linking Carol to Apex, Mark felt a surge of confidence. He drafted a detailed 7-page letter to the HOA Board of Directors, laying out his case with the precision of a legal brief. He attached copies of all the documents, highlighting the relevant sections. He explained that not only was the violation baseless, but the board president appeared to be acting under a severe conflict of interest. He demanded an immediate dismissal of the violation and all fines. He sent it to Prestige Management via email and, for good measure, via certified mail. He expected a swift, apologetic reply. Instead, he got silence for 3 days. Then, a new letter arrived. This one wasn't from the management company. It was from the law firm of Peters, Davies, and Finch, the official legal counsel for the Sunset Valley HOA. The tone was no longer procedural. It was overtly hostile. The letter acknowledged receipt of his correspondence, but dismissed his evidence as irrelevant to the board's interpretation of the governing documents. It informed him that his hearing had been scheduled for the next monthly board meeting in 2 weeks. It also stated that, due to his refusal to cure the violation, the board had voted to fast-track the fining process. His outstanding balance was now $500, and if it was not paid, the board would hold a vote at the hearing to place a lien on his property. As a final, brutal blow, the letter informed him that, per the bylaws, all legal fees incurred by the HOA in enforcing the covenants would be billed back to him. The firm's letterhead listed their hourly rate. The threat was no longer just a few $100s in fines. It was now thousands in legal fees and a lien on his grandfather's ranch. A lien was a cloud on the title, a legal claim that could prevent him from selling or refinancing, and could ultimately lead to foreclosure. Carol wasn't backing down. She was doubling down, using the association's lawyers to intimidate him into submission. She knew he had the facts on his side, so she was changing the game, making it too expensive and too risky for him to fight. That evening, as Mark sat at his desk, the lawyer's letter casting a pall over the room, his phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. "Is this Mark Thorne?" a quiet voice asked. "It is. Who's this?" "My name is Ben Carter. I'm on the HOA board." Mark's posture straightened. "Ben Carter, the junior board member. Mr. Carter, I assume you've seen my letter." "I have," Ben said, his voice low and strained. "And I'm calling because this has gone too far. I can't say much, and you can't tell anyone I called you. But you need to know what you're walking into." Ben became Mark's reluctant, anonymous source from inside the machine. He explained that Carol controlled the board. The other members were either her allies or too intimidated to challenge her. She had presented Mark's letter to them not as a legitimate legal challenge, but as the rantings of an uncooperative outsider. "She's smearing you, Mark," Ben said, the words coming in a rush. "She's telling everyone you're a difficult, litigious man who inherited a property and thinks he's above the rules that keep our community nice. She's painting you as the enemy. At the hearing, she'll have the votes. It's a setup. They'll listen to you, thank you for your time, and then vote to uphold the fine and authorize the lien. I'll be the only no vote." A sense of dread washed over Mark. His perfect, fact-based case didn't matter. This wasn't a court of law. It was a kangaroo court run by a corrupt official who had poisoned the jury. "Why are you telling me this?" Mark asked. There was a long pause. Because I joined this board to help with the community garden, not to help a real estate agent bully a man into cutting down his family's trees for a commission. But Carol is persuasive. And she's not just after you. What do you mean? There's a widow, Mrs. Gable, on Lilac Court, Ben said, his voice dropping even lower. She's 87, lived here for 30 years. Carol's been fining her for having unapproved garden gnomes. 2 little ceramic gnomes her late husband gave her. The fines are up to $600. The woman is on a fixed income. She's terrified. If you go into that meeting and just attack Carol, even if you win, the rest of the board will circle the wagons. They'll bury their heads and retaliate against people like Mrs. Gable to prove they're still in control. It's not just about exposing Carol anymore. You have to think about who else gets hurt in the crossfire. The call ended, leaving Mark in stunned silence. Ben had just handed him a second, more complex obstacle. His fight was no longer just about his property or his grandfather's legacy. It was about an entire community held hostage by a petty tyrant. He couldn't just win. He had to win in a way that didn't cause collateral damage to the very people who were too scared to fight for themselves. He now faced a profound moral dilemma. Could he save his own property without inadvertently sacrificing the vulnerable residents Carol also had in her sights? The hearing in 2 weeks was no longer just a hearing. It was a battle for the soul of the neighborhood. The community clubhouse buzzed with the low murmur of suburban discontent. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and cheap air freshener. About 30 residents dotted the folding chairs, a mix of the curious, the concerned, and the openly hostile neighbors Carol had primed with her narrative of the arrogant outsider. At the front of the room, behind a long folding table, sat the board of directors. Carol Stone was in the center, radiating a serene, presidential authority. To her right sat Ben Carter, who steadfastly avoided Mark's gaze, his face a pale mask of anxiety. A large digital countdown clock was projected on the screen behind them. It currently read 5:00. Carol tapped the microphone. The next item on the agenda is the hearing for the violation at 1200 Old Creek Road. Mr. Thorne, you have 5 minutes to present your case to the board. The clerk will start the timer when you begin. Please approach the podium. Mark walked to the front of the room, his heart a steady, heavy drum against his ribs. He placed a single, slim file folder on the podium. He wasn't nervous. He was focused. The anger and frustration had been burned away over the last 2 weeks, forged into a cold, hard resolve. He looked not at Carol, but at the faces in the audience, the skeptical, the indifferent, the worried. He was speaking to them as much as to the board. "Good evening," he began, his voice calm and clear. The clock started its silent, relentless descent, 59:458. "My name is Mark Thorne. I'm here tonight to address a violation notice concerning a stand of oak trees on my family's property. The association claims these trees violate Section 8.4.2 of the CCNRs. I am here to demonstrate, with public and verifiable documents, that this claim is not only false, but is being made in bad faith." He opened the folder. Exhibit A. He held up a copy of the formal violation notice he had received. This is the notice, citing the bylaw regarding the preservation of view corridors. It is the entire basis for the fines and the lien threat against my property. He set it down. The association's argument rests entirely on the location of this view corridor. So, I went to the county recorder's office to find the legal, official definition of that corridor. 415 remaining. Exhibit B. He held up a large, professionally printed copy of the official county plat map for the Sunset Valley subdivision. He had mounted it on foam board, using a laser pointer. He directed the board's attention to the map. "Here is my property, 1200 Old Creek Road. As you can see, it is explicitly noted as not a part of this plat. And here, the red dot traced a clear boundary line is the designated view corridor easement, as is legally and indisputably documented in the county's public records. The easement ends 50 feet from my property line. My trees are not, and have never been, within the association's view corridor. Therefore, no violation has occurred. A ripple of murmurs went through the audience. A few people leaned forward, squinting at the map. Carol's serene expression tightened. Just for a second. 320 remaining. This raises the question. Mark continued, his voice even. If the violation is so clearly baseless, why has the association pursued it so aggressively, even hiring lawyers at the homeowner's expense to find that answer? I reviewed the board's meeting minutes, which I had to formally request. He held up the redacted pages. Exhibit C. These are the minutes from the August board meeting. As you can see, the sections pertaining to a new development proposal by a company called Apex Luxury Homes have been heavily redacted, hidden from the members of this community. I was curious what was behind these black bars. 240 remaining. So I cross-referenced the public records for Apex Luxury Homes. He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. He looked directly at Carol Stone. Her face was now a stony mask, her eyes burning with a cold fire. Exhibit D. He held up the final document. It was a copy of the corporate filing, showing Carol Stone's consulting firm had been hired by the developer. He followed it with the statement of economic interest. This public document shows that the president of this board, Ms. Carol Stone, stands to receive a significant personal commission from the developer, Apex Luxury Homes, a commission that is contingent on Apex being able to build and sell luxury lots. Lots whose primary value comes from an unobstructed view of Sunset Lake, a view that is currently blocked by my trees. The room fell into a dead, profound silence. The only sound was the soft hum of the projector. Every eye was now on Carol. Her mask of composure finally cracked. A flush crept up her neck. 110 remaining. Mark lowered the document. He never raised his voice. He simply presented the facts, letting them speak for themselves. This was never about a view from a park, he said, his voice resonating in the stillness. It was about using the power you grant this board as a tool to intimidate a private citizen for personal financial gain. It was about leveraging your dues to pay lawyers to threaten me, all in service of a secret real estate deal. The violation against me is a fraud. And it makes me wonder, how many other fines, how many other violations, have been issued not to protect our community, but for other, less noble reasons. He looked at the clock, 0:28. He looked at the residents, then at the board. The evidence is clear. I trust you will do the right thing. He stepped back from the podium. The clock ticked to 0. The silence in the room was absolute, a palpable thing, heavy with shock and betrayal. The silence stretched for a full 10 seconds before the room erupted, not into shouting, but into a chaotic flurry of hushed, angry conversations. Residents turned to each other, whispering, pointing at the documents Mark had left on the podium. The board members looked from Carol to each other, their faces a mixture of confusion, shock, and dawning horror. Carol Stone sat frozen, her face ashen. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The serene authority had evaporated, leaving behind a woman exposed and cornered. It was Ben Carter who broke the spell. He pushed his chair back, stood up, and cleared his throat. All eyes snapped to him. I believe, Ben said, his voice shaky but clear, that we need to address this immediately. I move to dismiss. with prejudice. The violation notice against Mr. Thorne's property. Seconded, another board member mumbled, looking anywhere but at Carol. All in favor, Ben asked. Taking charge. 4 hands, including his own, went up immediately. Carol remained motionless. The motion passes. Mr. Thorne, the violation is dismissed. But Ben wasn't finished. He looked at the other board members, his expression hardening with a newfound resolve. Furthermore, in light of the evidence presented concerning a clear and undisclosed conflict of interest, I move that the board formally censure President Stone for her actions. Effective immediately. She is to be removed from her position as president and as a member of the Architectural Control Committee, pending further investigation. Second, someone called out from the audience. And, Ben continued, his voice gaining strength, I move that this board commission a full, independent financial audit of the association's dealings for the past 2 years, with a specific focus on all contracts, legal expenditures, and any and all interactions with Apex Luxury Homes and its affiliates. Another board member seconded the motion. When Ben called for the vote, it was again 4-1. Carol was stripped of her power in less than 60 seconds, rendered impotent by a quiet man with a file folder. The meeting descended into chaos. Residents surged forward, demanding answers. Carol, finally moving, gathered her purse and swept out of the room without a word, a queen fleeing a coup. In the weeks that followed, the fallout was swift and decisive. Mark received a formal letter from Prestige Community Management, written on behalf of the new interim board, containing a profound apology. It confirmed that all fines had been reversed and the threat of a lien expunged from all records. The independent audit Ben had called for uncovered a pattern of financial mismanagement and favoritism under Carol's leadership, leading to a complete overhaul of the board in the next election. Carol Stone sold her house and moved away within 2 months. At the next board meeting, with Ben now serving as the interim president, Mark was invited to speak again. This time, he wasn't a defendant. He was a respected member of the community. He didn't talk about his own ordeal. Instead, he proposed a new bylaw requiring mandatory disclosure of any potential financial conflicts of interest for all board members, and mandating that all meeting minutes be published in full, without redactions. The motion passed unanimously. But Mark knew his victory wasn't complete. He thought of Mrs. Gable and her garden gnomes. He thought of Ben's warning. He had the community's attention and respect, and he chose to spend that capital not on himself, but on them. There's one more thing, Mark said, addressing the board and the packed room. My situation has brought to light how easily the association's rules can be used to target residents. I'm sure my case is not the only one. I propose that the board declare a full amnesty and reversal of all fines levied for minor aesthetic violations in the past year. Let's wipe the slate clean. Let's give people like Mrs. Gable on Lilac Court their peace of mind back. This community shouldn't be about punishment and control. It should be about being good neighbors. A warm, spontaneous round of applause filled the room. Ben Carter smiled, a look of immense relief on his face. The motion was immediately made and passed without dissent. Mark's personal battle had concluded not just with his own vindication, but with the restoration of fairness for the entire neighborhood. He hadn't just saved his grandfather's trees. He had helped the community reclaim itself. Driving home that night, past the ancient oaks standing dark and silent against the starry sky, he felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't the quiet he had initially sought, but something deeper and more meaningful, the quiet that comes after a worthy fight, well fought and truly won.